access and knowledge are not the same thing. You can be permitted to enter a place and prohibited from describing what you found there. The two are separate. The entry permit says nothing about what happens to the information you acquire by using it. Japan has 12 areas where this distinction is not theoretical. They are places you can enter, with the correct credentials, at the correct time, through the correct process. And they are places where, once you have entered and seen what is inside, the discussion of what you saw is subject to constraints that range from formal legal agreements to institutional understanding, to something older and more difficult to define than either. In this video, we count down 12 Japanese areas where entry is permitted and discussion of what is inside is not. Stay with me to the end, because area number 1 is a place that millions of Japanese people consider the most sacred location in their country, where entry is available to anyone, and where no one who has entered the innermost areas has ever publicly described what they saw. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let us begin. Ise Grand Shrine in Mie Prefecture is Japan's most sacred Shinto site. The shrine complex dedicated to Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and to Toyuka, the goddess of food and agriculture. The outer areas of both shrines are accessible to the public. The inner sanctuaries, the Naiku and Geku inner precincts, are accessible only to members of the imperial family and to the senior priests of the shrine. These individuals enter. There is no prohibition on their entry. There is, however, no public account from any living person of what the inner sanctuaries contain. Not because no one enters, because the transmission of that information is governed by a tradition of sacred discretion that has operated without interruption for over 1,000 years. The inner sanctuaries are entered. What they contain has never been publicly described by anyone who has been inside. Mount Koya's Okunoin Cemetery, the 2-kilometer sacred forest containing the mausoleum of Kobo Daishi, is open to the public along its main path. The areas beyond the marked boundary of the public route, however, are accessible to the priests and monks who maintain the sacred site. They enter these areas regularly for maintenance, for ritual purposes, and for the ongoing care of the site that Shingon Buddhism has maintained for over 12 centuries. The monks who enter the areas beyond the public boundary have, across the history of the site, not publicly described what those areas contain. This is not formalized in any document available to researchers. It is an institutional understanding that operates within the Shingon tradition, the same tradition that has maintained Okunoin without interruption since the 9th century. The monks enter. The areas beyond remain undescribed. Following the 2011 Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident, the Japanese government established evacuation zones, restricted zones, and, less discussed, areas that were designated as accessible for specific purposes under specific protocols. Some of these protocol-governed areas are accessible to authorized personnel, utility workers, researchers, environmental assessors, decommissioning teams. The access agreements for some of these areas include provisions that restrict the authorized personnel from publicly discussing specific observations made during their work in the zone. The restriction is not on discussing the zone's existence or its general condition. It is on discussing specific observational categories, specific findings, specific readings, specific conditions encountered, that fall within the scope of the access agreement's confidentiality provisions. The workers enter, they observe. The specific observational categories that the access agreements restrict are not publicly described. What those categories cover has not been published. Japan's self-defense force installations are accessible to a range of personnel: contractors, civilian employees, family members of station personnel, visiting officials. The access is governed by security protocols that include, as a standard component, provisions restricting discussion of specific operational and infrastructural details observed during the authorized visit. The discussion restrictions are not unusual for military facilities. What is less discussed is the scope of what those restrictions cover in specific Japanese SDF installations, the specific categories of infrastructure, equipment, and operational arrangement that the access agreements define as discussion restricted, not because the installation's existence is classified, but because specific observed details within it are. Personnel who have been inside specific SDF facilities under access protocols have described the experience of navigating the discussion restriction, knowing what they observed and which portions of that observation they can and cannot discuss, without describing the restricted portions. Yakushima Island's UNESCO World Heritage status has produced a research access framework that permits academic and scientific personnel to enter restricted forest areas not open to general visitors. The research access agreements that govern this entry include confidentiality provisions that restrict researchers from publicly discussing specific findings made in the restricted areas prior to formal publication. A standard academic non-disclosure framework. The specific findings that have been made in the Yakushima restricted areas and that are currently under the pre-publication discussion restriction cover categories of biological and ecological observation that, when the restriction lifts upon publication, will be published in academic journals with limited public reach. Researchers who have entered the restricted areas under these provisions have described navigating the discussion restriction, being unable to discuss what they found with colleagues who have not signed the same access agreement, without describing the restricted findings. Japan's civilian nuclear power facilities, the plants operated by regional utilities across the country, are accessible to a range of authorized personnel beyond their regular workforce. Safety inspectors, regulatory officials, contractor personnel, emergency preparedness assessors. The access protocols for each facility include employment and contractor agreements that restrict discussion of specific operational and safety-relevant observations made during authorized visits. The restrictions are standard practice in the nuclear industry globally. What varies between facilities is the scope of what the discussion restrictions cover, the specific operational and safety categories that the access agreement defines as restricted, and the duration for which the restrictions apply. Personnel who have conducted authorized inspections of specific Japanese nuclear facilities under these agreements have described the experience of the discussion restriction without describing the restricted content, the awareness of what they observed and what they cannot publicly discuss about those observations. The Status of Forces Agreement between Japan and the United States governs access to American military installations on Okinawa. Under specific provisions of the agreement and its implementing arrangements, certain areas of the installations are accessible to authorized Japanese personnel, government officials, environmental assessors, liaison officers, for specific purposes. The access arrangements include provisions that restrict the authorized Japanese personnel from publicly discussing specific observational categories made during their authorized presence in the installation areas. The restrictions operate within the bilateral framework of the SOFA and are not publicly itemized. The discussion restriction provisions are themselves subject to confidentiality. Japanese officials who have conducted authorized visits to specific Okinawa installation areas under these arrangements have not publicly described what they observed in the areas they were permitted to enter. The access occurred. The discussion did not. Specific sites in Japan that were used for wartime research purposes, particularly those associated with the Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 731 and related programs, have been subject to post-war remediation, development, and in some cases, public memorialization. Some of these sites contain sections that are accessible to researchers, archaeologists, and government assessors under access frameworks that include discussion restrictions for specific findings. The restrictions in some cases reflect standard archaeological pre-publication agreements. In other cases, the restrictions derive from government administrative frameworks that govern what can be publicly discussed about findings at specific wartime research sites. The two categories of restriction, academic and administrative, operate simultaneously at some sites. Researchers who have accessed specific site sections under these frameworks have described navigating dual-category discussion restrictions without describing the restricted content from either category. The Imperial Household of Japan administers a significant portfolio of properties, forests, gardens, farms, and historic estates, some of which are accessible to authorized personnel for specific purposes. Agricultural management, forestry work, conservation assessment, heritage maintenance. The access to these properties is governed by Imperial Household Agency protocols. The protocols include provisions that restrict the authorized personnel from publicly discussing specific observations made during their work on imperial properties. The restrictions are not formalized in the kind of signed non-disclosure agreement that commercial contexts use. They operate as institutional understanding. The kind of understood discretion that the Imperial Household Agency has maintained across its organizational history without the need for formal documentation. Personnel who have worked on imperial properties under these protocols have described the institutional understanding of the discussion restriction without describing the content that the restriction covers. Japan's psychiatric hospital system maintains archive sections at specific facilities, historical patient records, institutional records from earlier operational periods, research documentation that are accessible to authorized researchers, historians, and legal professionals under medical privacy frameworks. The access is permitted. The discussion of specific content encountered during authorized access is governed by the medical privacy legislation that covers psychiatric records. The discussion restrictions derived from medical privacy law are standard for patient record contexts. What is less standard is the scope of what the restrictions cover at specific historical psychiatric facilities. The archival content from institutional periods before contemporary privacy frameworks existed that nonetheless falls within the coverage of current restrictions because of the continuing privacy interests of surviving patients and their descendants. Researchers who have accessed specific psychiatric archive sections have described the experience of the restriction without describing the restricted archival content. Beyond Ise Jingu, a number of other Shinto shrines across Japan maintain inner ritual areas that are accessible to initiated shrine priests for specific ceremonial purposes. These areas are not accessible to the general public, but are entered regularly by the priests whose ritual role requires their presence there. The tradition of not publicly describing what these inner ritual areas contain is not a legal restriction. It is a component of the ritual understanding that governs the priesthood, the same understanding that defines what can be transmitted between priests and what remains within the ritual context of its use. The inner ritual areas are entered. The discussion of their contents is governed by the same tradition that has defined the boundary between the accessible and the undescribed for as long as those shrines have operated. Some of these shrines have operated for over 1,500 years. The innermost area of Ise Grand Shrine, not the inner precinct accessible to the imperial family and senior priests, but the specific structure within that precinct that constitutes the shrine's most sacred physical point, is accessible to a smaller group still. The specific individuals whose ritual role permits them to approach this point are fewer in number than those who enter the inner precinct, and their approach is governed by the same tradition of sacred discretion that has operated across the shrine's history. No living person has publicly described what they observed at this point, not because no living person has been there, because the tradition of not describing it is older than the concept of public description as it currently exists. The innermost point of Japan's most sacred shrine is entered. The discussion of what is there has never occurred. In over 1,000 years, no one who has been permitted to approach it has described what they approached.